Good, then let's get started. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been here before once, and I think it's 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, quite some time. And there was that was a meeting organized by Bertram Turner, and that was on a similar topic, moral psychology and punitive theory in law. And so that was quite shaping for the interests I developed. And I also wrote a dissertation on revenge from a social psychological perspective. So the ideas, psychological ideas around retribution, revenge, punishment, and also forgiveness and so on. These are things that I find super fascinating and super interesting. And to be honest, many of the questions I originally had when I started writing my dissertation have not been answered so far, neither by me nor by other people. So it continues to fascinate me. Okay, so the title of this talk is How Social Psychological Research Can Inform Punishment Theory. And basically what I'd like to do is give you an overview of a project that I'm doing together with Ralf Köllbel, who's the chair of criminal law and criminology at the University of Munich. And this is funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung. The title of that project is Revenge, Retribution, Satisfaction. So again, the things that I find interesting, legal implications and social psychological research. And it's a 2-year funded project. And I would have loved to give you the final results of that project. But unfortunately, we're still like in the middle of doing all we want to do. So it's more a work in progress Zwischenstand thing I can give you today, and I hope that's okay. The research, the overarching research question of that project is, well, starting from the assumption or starting from the observation that many punishment theories operate with explicit and implicit assumptions about human nature. And then the question is, what exactly are these assumptions and how does empirical research have to say about them? Our methodological approach consists of 4 steps, and luckily for me, 3 of those steps are done by Ralf Köllbel, and I'm only responsible for the last one. So Ralf's job is to scan the contemporary international discourse about punishment theories, and that includes legal philosophical theories about the legitimization of punishment in legal philosophy and criminal law. And then to map or structure those theories, or at least the theoretical arguments these theories work with, and then distill or identify or delineate those arguments that are descriptive in nature and that make assumptions about human nature. And that is quite time consuming, as Ralf told me, because sometimes these assumptions are very rarely are these assumptions explicit. Very often these assumptions are implicit, and you have to put quite some degree of interpretation in the text in order to find out what exactly is the assumption in that text here. And these assumptions are, when I talk about assumptions about human nature, I mean assumptions about how humans work, how their mind works, what they want, what they're after, what their desires are, and so on. And then social psychology or psychology, including experimental philosophy and behavioral economics, so psychology in a larger sense, comes into play and can start evaluating, that's probably not the right term, of giving an idea about which of these assumptions hold true to empirical assessment. So which of them can be, what does empirical research tell us about the radicality of these assumptions? Okay, the idea or the notion that normative theories can be informed or work with assumptions about human nature is totally not new. That's a classic in legal philosophy. Many old legal philosophical ideas talk about the human punishment instinct. And I'll just give you the 3 or 4 quotes that I find most telling. The famous Francis Bacon quote talking about revenge as a kind of wild justice. and then the law must weed this out, so curb the vengeful instincts that people have into something that is at least less morally dubious. And then there's this quote from, and probably you're not the audience, I have to tell you about where this quote comes from. It's from the famous Furman versus Georgia case in the US that was handled before the US Supreme Court. And is one of the Supreme Court judges. And in his consent, and in this case, basically that case here led to a moratorium on capital punishment in the United States for 3 or 4 years, I think. Between 1972 and 1976, there was no capital punishment, no death penalty in the United States due to this case. And one of the consenting judges or justices, I think are called in the US Supreme Court, he wrote, the instinct for retribution, so he's talking about instinct for retribution, is part of the nature of man, and channeling that instinct in the administration of criminal justice serves an important purpose in promoting the stability of society governed by law. Yeah, and then probably my most famous quote is this one, James Stevens. The criminal law stands to the passion of revenge in much the same relation as marriage to the sexual appetite. And you see the idea that there's an idea or a notion about what humans are, what's in them, and then what's in them is obviously bad or morally dubious, and then the law must come and rescue humans from what's in them. And that's a narrative that's basically in the written in the genes of legal theory. Now, when looking at more contemporary theories, punishment theories, they still work with that narrative. They still use that narrative. But one thing that Ralph, when he was trying to map the theories, one thing he came across is that many of the theories assume that the punishment instinct, the punitive instinct, is something bad. It's morally bad. But the theories can be differentiated with regard to the question, why exactly is the punitive instinct bad? Or what exactly is bad about that instinct? And he found that there are some theories that would say, well, it's the instinct itself that is bad. So the passion for revenge, the instinct itself, something that's morally bad. And then there's a group of theories that would argue it's not the instinct itself that is bad, but it's the fact that these instincts have a particular psychological feature. And the psychological feature is that they are moralized. Moralized in terms of they are very tenacious, they feel right to the person, and even if a person makes the punitive judgment and receives information that should logically change their initial judgment, it doesn't, because they are so sticky. So moralized attitudes, one aspect or one feature of moralized attitudes is they feel so right, you don't change them, right? And maybe it's not the instinct itself, it's the moralization that is problematic. And then there's a group of theories that would say, no, it's not the instinct that is bad, it's not the feature of moralization that is bad, but it's what's coming out of that instinct. So the realization of the punitive instinct, or the way the instinct manifests in behavior is bad. Vigilante justice, chaos, disorder, or vendettas. Okay, and let me just take this quote as a starting point and maybe illustrate how we in this project are dealing with the question how social psychology can inform punishment theory. There's a quote from Bublitz in a Festschrift for Merkel, right? Exactly, for Merkel. And the quote goes like this: retributive intuitions are formed on the basis of sparse data. Counter-arguments are not taken into account in their creation. Nevertheless, they often have the appearance of great certainty and unconditionality, but this appearance is deceptive and exaggerated. So he's not talking about the badness of punishment instincts per se, but more about the fact that they are so hard that they're so sticky, so tenacious. And one way of testing, or one empirical research that can inform us whether this assumption is valid comes from a study in which I was involved. It was published 2 years ago. It's a project that was led by E.L. Aharoni in the US. And our original question was not exactly how tenacious are punitive judgments. The idea behind that project was a different one, but the design and the results are informative for the question, how tenacious are punitive judgments. What we did is we conducted a very classic vignette study. Participants read a vignette about a crime that happened, or more precisely about two crimes, a low seriousness crime and a high seriousness crime. The low seriousness crime was second-degree theft, and the high seriousness crime was aggravated robbery. And we were lucky to have a very, very informative, very nice sample, because first of all, it's large. It was relatively large. I don't know what kind of largeness of samples you are accustomed to. But in psychology, you would consider that large, 500, more than 500 US respondents. But more importantly, the sample was matched to socio-demographic distributions. So we can say it's relatively representative when it comes to socio-demographic features. Okay, so participants read these two vignettes, and then immediately after the participants read the vignettes about the case, they were asked, how long in prison should the defendant be incarcerated for this offense in years? And after that initial judgment about jail time, they received information about two things. First of all, the defendant's suffering during, so we told participants, well, yeah, the defendant has already spent 10 weeks in jail. And we told them that during that 10-week jail time, the defendant either suffered a lot physically and psychologically or not. And the second, so that was manipulated experimentally randomly. And then we told them about moral change or signs of moral change. So we told them either during that 10-week jail time, there are signs that the defendant regrets what he did. He understands that his actions were wrong. He wishes to apologize for his actions to the victim, versus no understanding, no regret, no wish to apologize. And then after receiving the information, participants were asked exactly the same question again. How much, now we're asking you again, how much time do you think that defendant should spend in jail? It's exactly the same question as above. Okay, and the results. So when you look at the results, you see on the y-axis a scale from minus whatever to plus whatever. 0 would mean that participants did not change their initial judgment about appropriate jail time. Positive values mean that at the second occasion of measurement, jail times were longer, so the sentence was harsher. And negative values means the opposite. And what you can see here is for the low seriousness crime and for the high seriousness crime, moral change has quite some impact on the change on the intra-individual change in appropriate jail time. People think that the defendant deserves more jail time when there was no moral change, but less jail time on average if there was moral change. And also we see some effects of whether or not the defendant suffered, but this is something that I'd like to go into detail later in this talk. So when you look at these results, you could say, well, are punitive judgments malleable or tenacious? Well, this looks like as if they are quite malleable. They do change quite a lot. But then again, it's interesting to look at the people who did not change their initial judgment. And this is 73.5% who did not change their initial judgment after they received the additional information. And that casts some doubts on the question, are these judgments actually malleable, right? So they are, to some extent, they are tenacious. Not for everybody. A quarter of our participants did change their judgments, but for the majority, they did not change their initial jail term verdict. Okay, and the second idea that is built into Bublitz's quote, the quote that I showed you earlier, is the idea that punitive judgments are intuitive. Or to be more precise, when people are forced or prompted to make an intuitive judgment, it is probably more retaliatory in nature, more retributive in nature, than if they had made a judgment more in a deliberative mode. So intuitive judgments make judgments more retributive. That's an idea that is part of many punitive theories. And we conducted a study in and I think I need to go into detail about this one. That was not a vignette study with a face, like the previous study I showed you. That was a study that worked with a real case, and it was the case of Amine Bahrami. And I don't know if you remember that case. It was in the news media, but 20 years ago, so quite some time ago. And Amine Bahrami was an Iranian woman who, in the fall of 2004, was attacked by a suitor who she rejected, and the rejected suitor threw sulfuric acid in Amine Bahrami's face and blinded her because she had turned down his marriage proposals. And during the years following the event, Amine Bahrami fought very, very hard for her right to retaliate the attack. And finally, after 4 years, a Tehran provincial criminal court sentenced the perpetrator to be blinded in both eyes, according to the principle of qisas. This is possible in Iran. Now, Amine Bahrami got what she wanted, and 3 years later, when the day of the judgment was scheduled for end of July 2011. And what happened is super interesting, because in the very last moment, so the I don't know what you call them, the assistant handed the acid in Amine Bahrami's face, and she was allowed to pour the acid in the perpetrator's eyes. So she was obviously officially allowed to do that. But in the very last moment, she said, "No, I won't do it. I pardon the guy, Majid Moabi. I pardon the guy." So an interesting turn of events. And we used that case, described it to participants, and asked them 2 questions. One question: how do you feel about Amine Bahrami's to fight for her right to blind the offender? How do you feel about Bahrami's decision to blind the offender? And then later, how do you feel about her decision to pardon the offender on a scale from 1 to 6? And what is the twist here in that study is that we put one group of participants under cognitive load. Cognitive load means that they are charged with a cognitively demanding secondary task. The secondary task looked like this participant. So this was basically a study conducted on a computer. Participants worked on a computer. They had the computer screen in front of them and the keyboard below them. And their task was, they were told, every now and then a letter pops up on your screen, dependent on whether the letter is a vowel or a consonant or neither. Press one of the 3 keys, C, V, or N. So that's a cognitively charging task for participants to do. And it's a classic when you want to put people under cognitive load. Why do you want to put people under cognitive load? The idea is that if you reduce participants' working memory capacity, the cognitive capacities they have available, then you prevent them from thinking deeply about what they feel, about what they think, about what they are supposed to do, and you come closer to their intuitive judgments. That's the assumption, that's the idea. Okay, so we had 3 experimental conditions: a cognitive load condition, a deliberative thought condition, and a control condition with no further instructions. And what we found is, and the effect size was moderate, it was a eta squared of 0.06, which is a moderate in psychology. Under cognitive load, positive effects towards the blinding decision was higher. So participants felt more positively about Amine Bahrami's decision to fight for her right to retaliate when they are put under cognitive load. In the other 2 conditions, this was lower. So you could say in an intuitive mode, people approve more of personal retaliation than in a deliberative mode. Regarding the second question, what do you think? How do you feel about Amine Bahrami's decision to pardon the offender? No difference. And basically pretty high value. So everyone approves of mercy. Right? But there seems to be a slight tendency for an intuitive preference for retribution. Okay. And a final study that is informative for the question how intuitive are punitive judgments has been conducted by this gentleman over there, Valerie. And basically what Valerie did is, and Paul Rehren did, is they conducted a replication of earlier studies that used a so-called behavioral process tracing task in order to find out what are people's motives when they assign fair punishment. How does that work? Let me show you the design of Valerie's study. So in that case, they had about 340 participants. And the first thing participants do is they read a very vague, a very superficial descriptions of a crime, right? And their task is to assign a punishment for that crime. But obviously, the description of the case is so vague that they need more information. So they can gather, they can select more information. The information they can gather comes from 3 categories. Some of the information they can select, participants can select, is only relevant if you are, as participants, you are a retributivist, if you think about punishment in retributive terms. So, for example, one information was how serious was the crime. That is an info. If you want to align your punishment with crime seriousness, then you are thinking about punishment from a retributivist perspective, right? That's an information that is particularly important if you think punishment should be retributive, should close the injustice. Offender intent is saying something like publicity of the offense is not so relevant if you are a retributivist, but is much more relevant if you are somebody who believes in deterrence or who thinks that punishment should be aligned with deterrence. So I hope you get the idea. The information comes from 3 different information categories. And what we can do now, or what this process tracing does, it gives each of these information categories a so-called rank preference score. The rank preference score is basically the it's a score for the question how early in the selection process is information from that category chosen. Right? That's the idea. So if retribution-related information has a high rank preference score, that means that retribution-oriented information is chosen earlier in the process rather than later. Does that make sense? No. Okay. Really? Okay. You have a screen full of information. Let's picture a screen full of cards. On the one side of the cards, there's a question. For example, question, what happened? How serious was the offense? Or how many people were present during the offense? Or what do we know about the offender's prior record? And you can click on that card, and then the card swaps sides, and on the back side of the card, the answer will be shown. And then you can use that answer to calibrate your punishment. Now, if you are a retributivist, if your personal motive for assigning punishment is a retributive one, you should be interested in how serious was the crime and what was the offender intent, but not so much, because it doesn't play a role for retribution, how many people were present during the situation, during the offense, and so on. Does it make more sense now? Okay. So, and since you can only pick an information one piece at a time, it's informative to look at the sequence of information. What category does the first information people select come from? What information is the second one that people choose? What is the third one that people choose? And that gives you at the end a rank preference score. Right. Okay. And what Valerie also did, and this is interesting because none of the earlier studies have done that, they put half of their participants under a think carefully prompt. So they instructed them to, when you make your judgment, when you select the information, please deliberate your judgment and think carefully about what you do. And in a control condition, they had no prompt. So this is typically what happens in these behavioral process tracing studies. And this is from 3 studies that my former student Livia Keller conducted. And you see the highest bars, the highest rank preference scores are for the retribution-oriented information. So that means retribution-oriented information, retribution-related information comes earlier than deterrence-related information or incapacitation-related information or special prevention-oriented information and so on. That speaks for the idea that people are probably more intuitive retributivists than they are intuitive utilitarians. And Valerie and Paul Zeon found exactly the same pattern. However, the experimental manipulation of think carefully versus not think carefully didn't do anything with the results. So it's hard to tell from these results whether these judgments are really intuitively shaped. The original idea was maybe if you prompt people to think carefully, the rank preference score for retribution goes down a little, and the rank preference score for deterrence goes up a little, because thinking more deeply about punishment makes people more utilitarian. It doesn't. Okay. Good. I don't think I need to explain these kinds of normative punishment theories, but I only like to talk about retributive theories and the expressive theories and give you an idea of how we delineate human nature assumptions from those theories. When looking at contemporary retributive theories, I've kind of noticed that some of them have a non-consequentialistic justification and some of them have a consequentialistic justification. That sounds a bit weird probably, because usually retributive theories are often defined as being non-consequentialistic. Right? How can there ever be consequentialistic retributive theories? But I've shown an example earlier and later. And I think Ralph has a point. Okay, let's first look at the non-consequentialistic accounts. There are theories that would say, well, yeah, punishment is just because it's deserved. Well, it's a sentence you find in a text by Primoz. And then you have a slightly different. There's a group of theories that argue slightly differently, and they say basically, well, what is moral? What is immoral? What is right? What is wrong? Actually, we don't know. But the best we have is what people do, what people feel, what people want. And if most people want punishment, well, then, yeah, it's probably moral. These are, we call them the prima facie normative theories. Or here's a quote: the feeling of resentment provides the feeling of resentment in the public. Provides a reason for the state to punish the offender, even in the absence of beneficial consequences. Even in the absence of beneficial consequences, this makes this normative account a non-consequentialistic. And then there are so-called deontological public expectations account. And the idea here is that, well, the state should punish. Yes, it's the right thing to punish for the state because the state ought to do what the public expects. For example, here's a quote that illustrates this: punishment is meant to express the community's censure of the offender, and to do this, it must reflect the community's judgment of what is deserved. And then there's another non-consequentialist account that I find super interesting. Fiery Cushman talked about this. And the idea here is that, well, victims have a right to punish their offender, but many of them won't do because it's costly and it's risky. It comes with a risk of counter-retaliation. But they have a right to punish the offender. So who helps them getting their right? It's the state, right? Institutional mechanisms such as state-sponsored criminal justice system provide a handy workaround by establishing an authority that acts upon our sense of desert without fear of retaliation. And it's an interesting non-consequentialistic retributive theory. Now, what about the consequentialistic accounts? The idea here is that they also argue that the state should do what the public wants or expects from it, but not because it's right to do that, but because the consequences of not doing that are morally bad, right? So it's not so punishment may not be morally right, but not doing it leads to consequences that are morally bad. And for example, Tonio Walter is a legal scholar in Regensburg. I think he talks about punishment is useful because it leads to innergesellschaftliche Beruhigung, intra-societal calming. Robinson from the US says punishment helps attain a state of legal peace. And then there's an idea that punishment helps or affirms people's belief in a just world, and doing so is morally good. Now you can turn this around and say the consequence of failing to do what the public expects is morally bad, leads to vigilante justice, as Justice Stewart's consenting opinion, and the quote I've just told you, and loss of institutional trust. So these are consequentialistic, retributive theories. Now, what are assumptions about human nature in those theories? That's pretty difficult because the theories differ not with regard to their descriptive assumptions. They differ mainly with regard to their normative assumptions, and normative assumptions cannot be tested. But one thing all of these retributive theories have in common is that they make implicit assumptions about what people want. And in many of these theories, we find the assumption that justice is served, or people think that justice is served when the offender suffers. Seeing the offender suffer gives people a sense of justice achieved. And again, here two quotes. Moore's quote, "There is good evidence for the truth of the retributive principle that culpable wrongdoers must be made to suffer." Or even more harshly, and it's pretty severe, this one. Let me read it to you. "There is typically something out of joint when the wrongdoer does not suffer. Lack of suffering is strong evidence of lack of recognition. Wrongdoers who do not suffer will have failed to fulfill a duty that they have incurred in virtue of their wrongdoing." Wow, that's a quite bold statement. And the idea that suffering has something to do with a sense of justice achieved can also be found in psychological theorizing. Nico Freider once wrote, "You get even in suffering. Those who cause pain should suffer in return, and if possible, at least to an equal degree. The sense of justice derives, I think, from a reflection upon comparative suffering." And that is an interesting assumption that can be empirically tested. The question here is suffering necessary? And now coming back to the very first study I showed you. Don't know whether you remember. This was the study in which we asked participants twice, how much jail time do you think is appropriate in that case? Low seriousness crime, high seriousness crime. And if you remember, we gave participants information about whether or not the offender suffered during his initial 10-week jail time. And if suffering is necessary, then that should make a difference for jail time adjustments, right? Does that make sense? And as I showed you before, and it's exactly the same figure, just with just only for the high seriousness crime, for the aggravated robbery crime. Yes, suffering does make a difference, but only when signs of offender remorse or signs of moral change or understanding are absent. So let me start here. When participants learn that during his 10-week jail time, the offender showed signs of remorse, then what participants on average do is they reduce the years of appropriate jail time, irrespective of whether there was suffering or not. So suffering is totally irrelevant in that case. However, if there are signs that the offender did not show signs of moral change, of understanding and so on, well, generally jail time goes up, but it goes up a little less when he suffered. So suffering is taken into account, but only if moral change does not occur. And I find this a super interesting pattern, because it could mean that people intuitively have two goals, a primary goal and a secondary goal. And the secondary goal only comes into play when the primary goal cannot be achieved. The primary goal is, I want the offender, or I expect the offender to morally change. But if that doesn't happen, if that is implausible, if there are no signs that this will occur, then at least I want him to suffer. Secondly, that would be an interpretation of those data. So is suffering necessary? Yes and no. If the offender shows signs of remorse, suffering is not a necessary condition of justice. But if the offender does show no signs of remorse, people at least want him to suffer. Okay? Okay. And then there are other findings that also work with that are informative for the same question. Bauer and Prof is also a nice study. This is a vignette study. It's quite similar to Aharoni's study. They gave participants information about whether or not the offender was happy in prison or unhappy in prison, or no information, and signs of remorse or moral change. And these were varied orthogonally. They ended up with 6 conditions. During his time in prison, the offender was happy with no moral change, happy and moral change, neutral, no moral change, neutral, moral change, unhappy. So 6, 3 by 2 gives 6 conditions. The dependent variable in that case was perceptions of justice on a scale from 0 to 10. And what they find is, and this is interesting, what they find is moral change is the important factor here. Whenever there are signs of moral change, justice is higher. Whenever signs of no moral change, justice is lower. They did find a significant main effect of suffering. But interestingly, that significant main effect of suffering was only, when I look at the figure, what I see is that this main effect of suffering was mainly driven by that condition here, the offender being happy in jail. And when the offender is happy in jail, justice is lower. There was no difference between the neutral and the unhappy condition. So that casts doubts on the question, is suffering necessary? Probably the answer from Bauer and Boama, well, the answer is no. Doesn't really play a role. And the effect was very, as you can see here, very, very small. Okay, and one older study, which I was involved in, that was a lab study. We invited participants to the lab. Oh yeah, and this is an opportunity for me to tell you about how we do our lab studies typically. We invite participants, they get a cover story. Cover story means that they are told what the experiment is all about, but it's not really true. They are told that there will be another participant in an adjacent room. However, there is no other participant and there is no adjacent room. But okay, so participants are told, well, you are working on a task at the computer together with the guy or the girl or the person in the other room. And depending on how good you are, you will receive a bonus. And then both participants are told, well, you earned a bonus of 10 euros or 5 euros. Now, please make a recommendation on how to distribute the bonus among the two of you. And our real participants, most of them, more than 90% of them, not the psychopath, but most of them say, let's split the bonus 50-50. But then they learn that the other participant in the other room makes a very unfair distribution recommendation. So in the end, our participants end up with fewer money, with a lower bonus than they actually deserve. Okay, that makes them angry, not super angry, but slightly angry, enough angry to be outraged and to want some punishment. We give them the opportunity to punish the other people. Not in this study though, but in a study that I'll show you later. And then we look at what the punishment does with our participants. This is the typical design of our lab experiments. Now, in that case, there was no opportunity for punishment for the participants. However, participants took part in a lottery. And in that lottery, participants, both participants A and B, could either win more bonus or lose some of their bonus or nothing. Okay, And that gives us, or we can construct three conditions out of that. One condition, so our real participants draw a blank lot, nothing happens. But then the experimenter remarks which lot the other person in the other room drew. And either it was a win lot, it was a win ticket. And that's really, imagine, that's the guy, or that's the person who split the bonus pretty unfairly to his advantage or her advantage. And then there's a lottery, and the bad guy draws a lottery ticket, and it gives him just another. I don't know whether you know what a VP-Stunde is. So Versuchspersonenstunde is something that our students have to do mandatory. They have to collect course credit hours, and that's really a valuable currency. So he draws a win ticket and gets just another hour of course credit. Or he draws a lose ticket and loses an hour of course credit. And then we had a third condition in which B draws a ticket and loses an hour of course credit, but then writes a message to our real participants saying, well, probably this was the punishment for being so nasty to you, or to quote, shit happens, too bad for me, but maybe this was my punishment for being so mean to you. And our dependent variable is often satisfaction deservingness. In that case, it was a 3-item scale. The higher the value, the more satisfaction, justice, deservingness, people get what they deserved, and so on, participants experience. And what is quite striking, I think, is that seeing the bad guy winning course credit is just as deserved, just as seeing him lose an hour of course credit. But what really makes the difference is seeing the bad guy losing an hour of course credit and receiving a message. He or she understood why that may have happened. So is suffering necessary? Not really. It's not about the suffering. It's about suffering and then making sense of that. But it's not about the suffering per se. Seeing the offender suffer from fate is not really helpful. Okay, how much time? 5 or 10?
Yeah.
10?
Yeah.
Okay, 10? 10 is 10 okay? Or tired? Okay, 10. All right. So expressive theories are built on the idea that punishment sends a message, and the expressive theories can be differentiated with regard to the question, a message to whom? Who's the receiver of that message? And there are expressive theories that argue punishment sends a message primarily to the victim. So these are the so-called victim-targeted accounts, because punishment gives victims back a sense of security and control. Actually, many theories or many theoretical ideas work with that theorem. Punishment gives victims a sense of security and control. And the second idea is punishment affirms the victim's status as a valued member in our society. That's an idea that I think even goes back to Hegel, or is it basically an idea that in Hegel's writings, I hope I don't say anything wrong. This is a nice quote that illustrates it upon acknowledgement. Punishment is an acknowledgement of the victim's disapproval of the crime. Then is the idea of punishment affirms society's solidarity with the victim. And this in turn supports the victim's coping and healing process. And some of the expressive theories go one step further and add a non-consequential, a moral flavor to it. For example, Holz argues that punishment fulfills a victim's right. The victim is entitled to have the state punishing the offender in his regard. Or to turn it around, not punishing the offender signals disregard for the victim. And then Tatjana's argument, which can be found in one of your texts from 2019, punishing the offender compensates for the state's monopoly on the use of force, which is also an interesting idea. So the state takes the monopoly on the use of force, so it deprives the victim of something, and to compensate for this deprivation, the state really has to make sure that punishment is assigned or it's compensated. I hope I understood it correctly. Okay. And then there are expressive theories that are not so much victim focused or victim targeted, but more offender targeted. The idea here is that punishment sends a message to the offender that she or he needs to change. And an entire literature on that idea has been written by Anthony Duff at the turn of the century. He talks about punishment as communicative sentencing. The idea here is that punishment aims to convince the offender to engage in moral self-reform, remorse, and understanding. And this, in turn, that's an interesting argument, that's an interesting assumption, is a necessary condition for victim forgiveness and a victim's willingness to reconcile or to engage in reconciliation with the offender. Okay. Expressive theories, that's interesting. Expressive theories are much, assumptions about human nature are much more prevalent in expressive theories than in retributive theories. Retributive theories are so normative in their outset. Expressive theories have assumptions about human nature built into them. There was one learning we had. Found that fascinating. Yeah, and the idea, especially Anthony Duff's idea, is that punishment invites or aims to convince the offender to engage in moral change. That is an idea that you find in many social psychological texts. Here's just one quote from Dale Miller, he's a social psychologist, and he writes, retaliation, from a victim's perspective, retaliation will only be satisfying to the extent that the perpetrator shows evidence of being educated. Minimally, this objective requires that the perpetrator knows why he or she is being punished. Okay, now, is there empirical evidence for this notion? Actually, yes, because I've showed you in the studies I showed you, in the findings I showed you, many of them had already empirical evidence built in there that there's something true to this idea. So punishment is actually more satisfying to third parties and to victims when there's evidence of moral change in the offender. And I don't want to repeat all these studies. Let me just show you one, or actually three more studies on the same issue, because this is an effect we in our lab find over and over again, and other people in other labs find that effect too. So this is again a lab experiment with a similar design as I told you about before. Participants come into the lab, they are told there's a second guy, they both do a task, they both do equally well on that task, they receive a bonus, participants share that bonus equally or want to share the bonus equally, but the other guy suggests a very unfair split of the bonus. Participants are angry, they have the opportunity to punish, about a third of them does, the other 2/3 don't, but 1/3 does. And now comes the crucial experimental manipulation. After assigning the punishment, participants can exchange messages on their computer screen in a chat. So they send a message via chat, and they receive a message from the other guy or person via chat. And in that study, we manipulated this message. We had a moral change message that read, hey, you reduced my bonus. Okay, I was greedy and I now see what's wrong with that. I shouldn't be such a jerk in situations like this. And we had a no change condition that read, hey, you reduced my bonus. Okay, I was greedy, but I don't see what's wrong with that. In situations like this, I always try to guess as much as I can. And the crucial difference is pretty clear, but we implemented this experimental manipulation because we wanted to find out, is it actually the moral change message that does the trick? Or is it just the acknowledgement? Is it the understanding? I know what happened. I know why you did this. I won't change though, but I know that I understood that this was a punishment. It was something different than just bad luck or so. Then we had a condition in which participants received no message. And obviously we could also take those participants who decided against punishing. And the dependent variable, again, is deservingness and satisfaction. And actually, moral change does the trick. This is a medium-sized, moderate-size effect. In absolute terms, it's not super large, but for psychological effects, it can be considered a medium-sized effect. Moral change leads to more satisfaction, deservingness than any of the other conditions. So it's more than just acknowledging, understanding that it was a punishment. It must be a moral change. At least a sign of moral change, and that leads to satisfaction. Okay, I'll skip this one because I'd rather want to show you this one because it's also from our own lab. That was a vignette study again. We manipulate, so in that case, participants were prompted or asked to imagine that they are working in a large company and they are working in a team consisting of 5 people. And one of the team members, Peter, he's a slacker. He's one of those who claims team achievements as his own. And he's the guy who always comes too late to meetings. And he's also not nice, he spreads rumors. So he's one of the bad guys in a team. Okay. At one point, participants have the opportunity to talk to their boss, the team leader, about Peter. When we ask participants, do you want to do that? Not 30%, but 80% of participants want to do that. Want to talk about about Peter with the boss. And now, after doing that, this is how the story goes. Peter asks participants for a private conversation. And participants say, yes, okay. And during that private conversation, Peter either shows signs of moral change in terms of, hey, I understand that my behavior was wrong, and I promise not to do it again in the future, or not. So there, the negative condition, the contrast condition was Peter does not mention that his behavior was wrong. And orthogonally, independently, we manipulated whether Peter in that private conversation signals appreciation, collegial respect, and so on, yes or no. The reason why we did that is there is a theory in social psychology that is quite prominent. It's the so-called needs-based model of reconciliation. And that theory assumes that victims, the thing that victims actually want is they want to have their status reaffirmed. Being a victim of a criminal or a social transgression reduces their social status. And that is critical, that is crucial. And whatever they want to do, the theory says a necessary condition for victims to be willing to engage in dialogue, in reconciliation attempts. A necessary condition is that somebody must reaffirm the victim's damaged status. And the people who invented that theory, since I'm being recorded, I have to frame it more carefully. They argue that our moral change messages, the messages that I showed you before, are nothing else than reaffirmations of the victim status, right? Hey, you reduced my bonus, I was greedy, and now see what's wrong with it. I shouldn't be such a jerk in situations like this. Implicitly, this may signal a reaffirmation of victim status. That's the argument that needs-based model of reconciliation people face us with. So in that study, the idea of that study was we wanted to manipulate more evidence for moral change and status reaffirmation independently, orthogonally, and see what happens. And what happens is this. Well, the needs-based model people have a point because the moral change message actually does empower or reaffirm the victim status. Yes, that's true. And the moral change message obviously also leads to a perception that probably the offender will change. But what is more important? So yes, they have a point. But the moral change effect cannot be reduced to an empowerment effect because over and above empowerment, moral change leads to justice-related satisfaction and deservingness. over and above empowerment. So the empowerment is controlled for, it's statistically removed here. And there's a unique effect of perceived moral change on justice-related satisfaction, and even more importantly, on willingness to reconcile with Peter. So moral change leads to a closure of the injustice gap, and that leads to a higher willingness to reconcile with the offender. And that is pretty much in line with what Anthony Duff says. Yeah. Let's say it's consistent with what Anthony does. Okay, all right. Summarize. You made it. Retributive theories. So two things that are, or three assumptions about human nature that are built into many retributive theories is punitive judgment are tenacious. Yes, quite. And they are highly intuitive. Not so much. Or it depends on how you look at it. But for example, Valerie's study shows, intuitive, it's not so intuitive. You get the same effects when you prompt people to think carefully. And then many retributive theories assume that punishment is mainly about seeing the offender suffer. Well, I don't think so. Only under certain circumstances, when as a secondary goal maybe, but not as a primary goal. Suffering is not a necessary condition for punishment to be felicitous, at least for the victim. Expressive theories have two implicit assumptions. One is they assume that punishment is about sending a message or effecting moral change in the offender. And I think, yes, that's the case. Many findings point in that direction. And they assume that offender moral change facilitates victims' willingness to reconcile and forgive the offender. And that is in line with the findings of the last study I showed you. Okay. Now, in order to spark the discussion a little, because I'd really like to hear, well, the good thing of giving a work in progress talk is that your feedback in situations like this can be built into the project. If I had given you this talk after our final report to the Volkswagen had already been sent away, well, that would be less useful, at least for me. So that's a good thing. But the downside of giving a work in progress talk is that, well, we're at, I'd say, 50 or 55% completion in that project. Okay, so to spark the discussion a little, I think the idea of extracting assumptions about human nature and testing them against what psychology has to say about them is useful. However, and this is the problem slide, it is unclear and it's very hard to say whether experimental designs really constitute a strong test of an assumption, right? Sometimes a design gives only sometimes a design, even if it's an experimental design, leaves open a number of alternative interpretations. And that is true also for many of the studies that I showed you today. Many of them leave open a whole array of alternative interpretations, and that is an issue, of course. And an even stronger issue is whether the relationship, main theoretisch die Abbildung, I don't know what that is in English, the relationship between the singular finding and the specific theoretical claim is bijective, eindeutig. So if a finding speaks only to this theoretical count, and the theoretical count allows has implications for only one design. And that is never the case. There's never something like a bijective relationship between theories or hypotheses and designs. And then we face the problem that empirical findings are notoriously volatile. They are super context dependent. Depends on when you do the experiment, how you do the experiment, with the materials you use, the country in which you do the experiment, super context dependent. And then, I don't know if you're aware of this, psychology has a replicability issue. There are many false positive findings in the literature. And it's right now, we're trying to clean up the literature and trying to find out which of these results are robust, which are not. And there's a file drawer problem. There are probably many more studies than those that are published rotting in the file drawer that maybe didn't find the effects that the published studies have found. And that's an issue. So how do we deal with that? And then a more fundamental question, and this is from a paper I reviewed recently. And in that paper, the author or the authors made the point that trying to inform normative theories on the basis of empirical results is futile because, and that's the argument, one should be wary of all claims that psychological facts align with philosophical theories. One reason is that our psychological intuitions may not in the end make sense of any coherent theoretical account, so all attempts to make sense of them must fail. But more importantly, one can reinterpret any empirical finding in a way to fit many, though not all, theories. And then the authors go one step further, and because they are focusing on, one thing that you've probably noticed is that I'm fascinated with Anthony Duff's ideas. And that's so the authors challenge us on here and say, however, one must keep in mind that normative accounts and descriptive theories have different aims. For example, Duff's communicative theory was not meant to make sense of our intuitions, and neither were the status-based theories. They do not consist in descriptive generalizations, they consist in arguments. So one question I have for you is does this project make sense at all? So thank you very much.